Hey there, how's it going? Welcome back to Kai City RC. My name is David and this is part 2 of the Force Hobby Genova build. Now if you haven't seen part 1, I'll put a link down below in the description, or you can click on the card that should be appearing somewhere up there right now. So the question that I'm sure is on everybody's mind, what's it like? Well, I will say final judgment until I've had a chance to run it, but so far I have been very impressed with what I've seen. It's not been all smooth sailing, but stick with me and I'll explain. So the buggy itself, I think a lot of people are going to see it's mostly plastic and think it's way overpriced for what it is. Now I'm going to get back to the price a little bit later on in this review, but I will say this, although the buggy is mostly plastic, the plastic used is of a very high quality. In fact, I would go so far as to say this is some of the nicest plastic I've seen on a kit, full stop. It's certainly up there with Kyosho's Legendary Series plastics, and so far the only Tamiya that I would say comes close in terms of plastic quality would be the XV01. So although it is mostly plastic, yeah, it's very good quality. And now that I've got the chassis together, it's very sturdy, there's no flex, so I wouldn't let the fact that it's mostly plastic put you off. Now, the buggy itself is really thought out, really well designed. It's clear to me that someone who has a lot of experience in the hobby has had a hand in how this has been designed and put together. For example, the chassis has so many nice little touches. Now, full disclosure, I have just come from a Tamiya Frog build, and pretty much everything I've built for the last 2 years has been re-releases from Tamiya or Kyosho. So I have very little experience with modern day buggies, modern day designs. In fact, the only modern day buggy I have is a DTO2. I think that's probably the most modern. So that said, just keep that in mind. Yeah, the chassis itself has got a lot of little nice touches. For example, I really like the fact that they provide you with a receiver box. Now it's quite small, but I don't think you'd have any issue fitting most modern day receivers in there. If you did run into problems, it would just be the vertical clearance. So when you plug the cables in, you might not be able to get the lid on. I don't think you'd have issue with the footprint itself. But I like the fact there is a receiver box. I like the fact that they provide a rubber grommet on the lid of the box, so you can run the antenna straight from the box, or if you want, they provide a secondary, more traditional antenna mounting point. I like the fact that they give you an ESC platform, so if you've got a larger ESC with perhaps heat sinks and cooling fans on top, then you can mount the ESC right at the back of the chassis, as close as possible to the motor in a location that gives you the maximum amount of vertical clearance. Now I chose to mount my ESC on the opposite side of the chassis to the receiver, and even there it's clear that they looked at the design and thought, okay, we need to modify the body. So the body on that side of the buggy has got a raised area to accommodate the cables coming out of the ESC. It's a small minor thing, but it all adds up. The other little minor things, the body is attached with body pins, but also you can use a Velcro, and on the chassis itself there are indentations where you should apply the Velcro, so it just makes alignment so much more easy because you know exactly where to put the Velcro. I like the fact that the spur gear cover has got this little rubber cap, and you can remove it and get instant access to the nut if you want to make adjustments to the slipper clutch. In all honesty, I found that trying to replace that little rubber cap after adjusting the slipper clutch was quite a faff, to be honest, and it would have probably been quicker just to whip the wheel off and undo the 3 screws holding the spur gear cover. But it's a thought that counts. Now, the build itself is straightforward. In fact, it's pretty easy. G-Force have chosen to provide their kit with pretty much everything pre-built. So it comes with a pre-built gearbox. All the shocks are pre-built. Even the turnbuckles are pre-built. But it doesn't stop there. All of the plastics used in the kit are pre-prepared. So the kit has no parts trees whatsoever. In fact, during the entire build, there's only one part where you need to trim some excess plastic off. So if you're an experienced builder, you're going to be somewhat disappointed by this build. Perfect for a novice, but for someone with experience, and especially someone who enjoys building, you're going to be disappointed. Now, the pre-built stuff is built to a very high standard. I tore down the shocks. They were really well built. I tore down the gearbox. The diff gears are extremely heavy duty, unusual to see in a buggy of this size. The gearbox is all metal gears. It was very well greased inside the diff, but the other gears not so much. The universal's pre-built as well. Turnbuckles pre-built, so you don't actually need any kind of measuring equipment because everything is pre-built. I checked the measurements and they were all spot on. But it's not all good news. There are a few issues, and most of them are to do with the manual. Now, I'll cut G4 some slack given that this is their first RC assembly kit, but at the same time, they've clearly stated this is aimed at the novice builder, and there are some glaring errors in the manual that I think need to be addressed. So in no particular order, there are a couple of mistakes. One is a minor one, but the second one had me spending about 10 minutes looking for some parts that were supposedly in bag C, but they were actually in bag D. Now, I should say the build, they tried to do it in a very logical order, similar to Kyosho style. So the manual is very similar to Kyosho. It's mostly diagrams, very little text, and it's a logical build progression. So the parts are all in bags, labeled bags A, B, C, D, etc. And you start the build by opening bag A, and then you follow the steps, and when bag A is finished, then you can open bag B, etc., and so on and so forth. The problem is, like step 1, they want you to put oil into the pre-built dampers. Now, the front shocks are in bag A, but the rear shocks are in bag D along with all of the other parts for the rear suspension. So basically, you start the build, you build the front first, then the main chassis, then the rear, and then do the body. And so straight from the get-go, you've got to open bag D and take out the rear shocks, but then you won't need to touch bag D again until much later in the build. Now, I know some people have a lot of space, and before they build, they like to settle parts out on the workbench. I don't have that luxury, so I would much rather do it where I just open bag A and concentrate on that, and when it's finished, open bag B. But obviously, the way they'd done it, I needed to have bag D open as well. You know, it's a small thing. There was a couple other errors. Now, it seems that G-Force are aware of these, and they're trying to get word out. I noticed my local online retailer had actually gotten a notice saying G-Force have issued some corrections for their manual, so they're aware of it and they're trying to fix it. But there are some other things as well. Things are not in a logical order in some places. So, for example, just off the top of my head, they had you fitting, or they were telling you to fit the Velcro to the inside of the body before they'd actually told you to prepare the body for painting and masking. So that was a bit of a head scratcher. And then I think the big one that's going to catch a lot of novice builders out, when you get to the rear wing, as you know, the way it's vacuum formed, you normally paint polycarbonate on the inside. Well, the body, it's really easy to work out what the inside is, but with the wing, because it's kind of upside down, reversed, they tell you to remove the protective film prior to painting the wing. But what they don't tell you is you need to mask off the other side, because that side doesn't have any protective film on it, and you're going to get overspray. Now, somebody with experience is going to notice this and obviously mask off, but a novice builder won't notice this, so they're very likely to paint and then realize they've got, overspray on the other side, which wouldn't be too bad if they're just doing one color. But if you're backing, like I usually, I usually back my main color with a different color, then you could run into issues. So aside from that, the buggy itself, there wasn't really anything that I didn't like. The only thing that comes to mind is the front axles had way more play on them than I would have liked, especially given the price point. I mean, it's nothing a few shims won't fix, but considering how well the rest of the buggy is built, it was a bit of an oversight on their part. Aside from that, there isn't really much else I didn't like. The gearbox being plastic, there's no metal motor mount, and its design is such that it wouldn't be very easy to implement one. But really, that's the only thing that I can say about the chassis that I didn't like. So now we've got to talk price, which I think is going to be something a lot of people are concerned about. So over here, it's 26,000 yen, which I believe is about $195, 160 pounds. And on the face of it, it sounds very expensive. Now, before I go any further, I need to kind of set the scene. So the G-Force Genova is designed for the domestic market only. Now, the domestic market is somewhat, I believe anyway, somewhat different to elsewhere. So in Japan, much like the 1-to-1 scale, the RC market is absolutely dominated by Japanese brands, Tamiya, Kyosho, Yokomo, etc. Now you can buy imported buggies, and you can get Schumachers, you can get Lossi, you can get Team Associated, you can get Axo, etc. But I would guess that their market share is minuscule in comparison. Imported buggies are just so much harder to find. They tend to be way more expensive. And even if you do manage to get your hands on one, getting spare parts is going to be that much more expensive and that much more difficult. So as a result, Japanese people tend to buy Japanese goods. So with that in mind, let's have a look. Now, another thing I need to stress is that we need to just concentrate on modern day buggy designs. I think if we start throwing in re-releases of vintage designs, it's going to muddy the waters somewhat. So let's say you are a newcomer to the hobby and you're in the market for a modern day two-wheel drive buggy. So what's on offer? Well, at the bottom end of the scale, you've got Tamiya with their DTO2, DTO3 chassis. Over here, they cost about 10,000 yen. So less than half of the cost of the Genova. After that, the only other Tamiya offering is the Tamiya TD2 Astute, which costs pretty much identical to the Genova. Still at this point, there's nothing from Kyosho, nothing from Yokomo. Now, if you go up to the 40,000 yen plus range, you start to get towards, you could pick up a Kyosho Ultima RB7, Yokomo YZ2, one of those variants. And most of the imported buggies, you're talking at least 40,000 yen, possibly more if you can get hold of one. So there isn't really that much of a choice. Now, given that the TD2 spec-wise and price-wise is almost the same as the Genova, I think I'll use those as a basis of comparison. So let's have a look at them. Now, full disclosure, I do not own a TD2 and I have not built one. I do have the manual and I've been through it and I've watched several YouTube videos. Big shout out to the OAG RC, among others. So even though I've not built one, I feel I have a pretty good understanding of how it goes together. So Genova and Tamiya's TD2, well, let me see, how do they differ? Well, the TD2 has a aluminium metal motor mount, whereas the Genova does not. The TD2 comes with full hex hardware, whereas the Genova uses Phillips screws. The TD2 just has regular drive shafts, but the Genova has universals. The TD2's gearbox, I understand, is pretty much all plastic, but the Genova's is very high quality metal, all metal gears. The Genova also has a slipper clutch as well. The TD2 has regular CVA dampers, but the Genova has big bore aeration dampers. And the TD2 comes with a ball diff, but the Genova comes with a gear diff. Now, which one is better is a matter of debate. I think it depends on where you run, surfaces you run on, but from a beginner standpoint, I would argue that the gear diff is more suitable. Now, from a builder's perspective, the Tamiya is way more enjoyable to build. It's a much more intricate, much more complex build, a much more unique design. The Genova, as I've said, is pretty much pre-built from the factory. But from a racer's point of view, if you're taking this car to the circuit, the track, the added complexity just means there are more things to go wrong. Was it that they say complexity is the enemy of reliability? So in that sense, the more simplistic design of the Genova is a benefit. Now, the Tamiya has lots of extra little bits and pieces, a driver figure to name but one, but overall I think they're pretty evenly matched. So as many people will be familiar with the TD2, if you feel that the TD2 is overpriced for what it is, then you're going to feel the same way about the Genova. Now, if I had to choose between the two of them, well, being a huge Tamiya fanboy, I'd probably go with the Tamiya. But that said, if I was planning on taking it to a track, a circuit, the Genova looks very appealing, very, very appealing. Now, I just want to go back to what G-Force set out to do, and that is offer a mid-level buggy to a complete novice, somebody who's never built that before. And it got me to thinking, if I was asked by a potential newcomer, someone who was just thinking of getting into the hobby, what kit I would recommend. Well, the first thing I would ask them is, where do you plan to run it? Now, if you plan to get into RC and run in the backyard or the local park or something like that, the question I think is quite easy to answer, because there are so many great Tamiyas and Kyoshos, and if you're running at the park, then anything from a grasshopper to a lunchbox is perfectly fine. But what if that person is looking to get into RC racing? So they want, right from the get-go, they want to take their buggy to the circuit. Then I would argue, and if you feel differently, please let me know in the comments, but then I would argue that your choices are somewhat limited, especially if you're on a budget. So if you're going to go with Tamiya, then DTO2, DTO3 would be the obvious choice. After that, there's nothing really until you start to get to like TD2 or Ultima or YZ2 territory, and I would argue none of those are really beginner friendly kits. Now, what Genova offers is a kit that is relatively high in spec, but something that a complete newcomer with zero building experience can put together. Now suddenly there's this whole other option available, you see. I mean, normally you would say, okay, you should get a DTO3 or something like that, run it as is, and as you get better, you would expect that the newcomer would start to notice the weaknesses, the limitations of the chassis, and then you could recommend, okay, right, well, I mean, straight from the get-go you're going to say you need to get bearings for the kit, but later on, if you want to improve the handling, okay, you need to get some turnbuckles, or you should get some different springs for the dampers, or you should replace the dampers altogether, or you're going to get better lap times if you replace the drive shafts with universals. And so although the starting point, the price of the kit in the case of DTO3 is much cheaper than Genova, over time you're going to add all these options to it, and it's going to bring the price much closer to the price of the Genova. I personally feel that would be a better route, because from an educational standpoint, from a learning standpoint, it would be better to start with a basic buggy, get used to driving it, and then recognize the limitations, and then buy hop-ups, install them, and appreciate what they're doing for the performance and the handling of the buggy. But what G-Force have done is they've just brought another option to the table. That's what I feel anyway. They've brought another option to the table. Okay, you can start off with a mid-level buggy that's got a lot of options already fitted, but you don't need any building experience. So right from the get-go, you can have something that's pretty competent on the racetrack, but you don't really need to have a lot of experience when it comes to building and construction. And in that sense, I think it's a win-win. It's nice that there are other options. You may feel differently, if so, let me know in the comments below. Well, that's how I'm choosing to look at it. In any case, it's so nice that another manufacturer has decided to enter the two-wheel drive off-road buggy market. In that sense, I think it's a win-win for everybody involved. Now, as I said, I haven't finished the build and I haven't had a chance to run it yet, so I'm going to reserve final judgment until I've done so. And also, I've just looked at the clock and I've been waffling on for a very long time. So if anybody's still awake out there, I do apologize. Thank you very much for sticking with me. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. I will, of course, do another video once it's complete and I've done a shakedown run, so stay tuned for that. Until then, my name is David. You've been watching Kai City RC. Happy RCing, everybody. Catch you in the next one.